tonight. And of course, I'm very warmly welcome Teresa Kulawik, our speaker tonight. And I only very briefly want to introduce Teresa. She is a professor of gender studies at Södertörn University in Stockholm. She holds a PhD in political science from the Free University of Berlin in Germany, from where we know each other. She was research leader and co-founder of the Center for Baltic and East European Studies between 2006 and 2011. So the center is at Södertörn University. And she is a specialist in comparative gender studies, and she published extensively on welfare state formation in Sweden and Germany with a gender perspective. Her current research examines the intersections between body and biopolitics and biomedicine with a feminist perspective. Also, with this perspective, she studies citizenship. And recently, she also developed an interest in public knowledge regimes, also with a gender perspective. She also works, moreover, on the intersection of political and cultural studies. So she's also really interdisciplinary, and she has, with this, she focuses on science and technology studies. And more recently, she developed a interest in epistemic inequality. And with this perspective, she explores the borderlands between post-decolonized and post-socialist scholarship. And this latest interest, the analysis of borderlands with a perspective on epistemic inequality, resulted in her latest book. And the title of the book is Borderlands in European Gender Studies Beyond the East-West Frontier. And she edited the book together with Sana Kravchenko, and it was published in 2020 with Routledge. And we will discuss some of the issues and arguments in the book today. So it's not really a book launch, but for Vienna, it's a sort of book launch. And yeah, we're very happy to first listen to your input and then discuss your insights. And I think I'll first give the floor to you, Teresa, and then after your talk, we talk a little bit about the technology of how we can discuss together. Yeah, so thanks for willing to give this talk, and please.
Thank you, Birgit, for this very kind presentation. I feel very honored. It seems that I have done so many things. Sometimes I don't think so, but this is how it is. And when you, as a political scientist, and you mentioned it, we know each other from the FU Berlin, from the Otto Suhr Institute, which has been quite an unusual political science place, because we always have been encouraged to do this interdisciplinary stuff, as long as it has something to do with politics. And this is what I actually draw from, which is quite different from the Swedish context, where I am now working since almost 20 years. I have a geographical background in Poland, but I'm socialized in Germany and West Germany, and my research focus, as Birgit mentioned, for many years on comparative studies on gender welfare state policies in Sweden and Germany foremost. When I began doing research about Poland, which coincided with the taking position at a Swedish university, I started to realize the asymmetric order, which I did not see before, of keynote speakers being from the West, scholars from the East relegated to a few clearly marked panels, whereas they were absent in the general theoretical panels. After for many years, I have been regarded as specialists on the Swedish model. In Germany, I have become a sort of Eastern killjoy, to use Sarah Ahmed's term, at the Swedish university, which is linked with a Baltic Sea Research Foundation that is not well esteemed by all scholars at the university. So my entry point to what has been critically referred to as the other Europe was the attempt to make sense of the legendary East-West debate in women and gender studies, in which I was not involved when it was at its peak around 1990, not 1900. And to understand these asymmetrical relations. The starting point was a conference some years ago, which had the title, "Why is there no happiness in the East? The Making of European Gender Studies," which aroused some smiles and prompted fruitful discussions, and a long ongoing commenting and learning process, which finally resulted in the publication of the book, Borderlands in European Gender Studies. Maybe you can, Verena, can you continue the slide so you will see the front cover? Rather than dwelling on the East-West dichotomy, the articles in this volume seek to dislocate it, shifting the epistemic landscape and launching a critical analytical perspective of Europe as borderland. The book makes a contribution to feminist theorizing, transiting between area, transnational, post-socialist, and post-colonial studies. So the book is not about Eastern Europe or the East-West divide as such, but rather how the hierarchies and divisions are created and sustained historically, politically, and in feminist theorizing. At the core of the proposed argument is a profound rethinking of time-space relations through the embedment of the East-West demarcation in a broader perspective of historical and contemporary global entanglements. This enables us to consider in a novel way hierarchizations and processes of rebordering within Europe, as well as efforts to problematize epistemic categories that imprudently reproduce asymmetries. To be sure, the East-West distinction within Europe is both long-standing and highly fluid and contested. Rather than a fixed division, it represents a metageography, a spatial and mental structure through which people order their knowledge of the world. As Manuela Boatka convincingly argues, the division ought to be conceived as embedded within the colonial and imperial design that shaped the emergence of the modern world system. The hierarchization within Europe was solidified according to spatial configurations between imperial centers and peripheries that had been pivotal in the 19th century, and mental maps of Easternness were linked to Orientalism, intrinsic to further European colonial expansion. From that time on, Eastern Europe and the Balkans were placed between Occident and Orient. In the geopolitical imaginary, this borderlands functioned not as Europe's other in terms of a binary qualitative alterity, but rather as Western Europe's incomplete self, employing mechanism of quantitative inferiorization. They were rated on a scale of Europeanness, underlaid with ethnic, racializing categories of Slavicness, a semi-developed, semi-civilized, semi-oriental. Characteristic of the Eastern European positionality is this ambiguity and lack of clarity of being at once part of Europe and outside Europe. Maybe you can go to the next slides where you will see the chapters. The book consists, I'm just showing you this. Some of you will know some names of the authors, others you might not know. You can say that the exploration of the theoretical concepts in this volume recasts founding categories of metropolitan feminist scholarship and seeks to advance feminist theory building by positing a contextualized, empirically grounded rethinking of analytical concepts. And this is part one. You can see this Agnieszka Graf on how Western academic feminism has traveled east. So thinking about post-foundationalism and what it has meant for Eastern European feminists and academia. Marina Blogajevich, I will probably not be able to go through all these chapters, but Marina Blogajevich, she has been one of the first who has launched the concept of semi-peripheral perspective with regard to gender relations in the post-socialist space. Then a text which I authored myself, Julia Gratskova, her chapter analyzes sort of the other woman in Soviet history, which has been for a long time ignored, one could say, by scholars who have been, feminist scholars have been doing research on Russia. Madina Tostanova has been among the first who has thematized this. Maybe the next slide, so you just see the chapters of the book. About here, the chapter, the part is about bodies, reproductive technologies, feminist internationalism, chapter by Katrin Braun, then Elżbieta Korolczuk about reproductive technologies and citizenship in Poland, and Heidi Kobak, who examines artwork from a decolonial perspective. And finally, the last part, it's about citizenship intersected, about European whiteness and East-West migration. The chapter analyzes Polish and Romanian migrants in Spain. Then Jana Karchenko explores the turn to an authoritarian state in Russia, the security state, and Trude Dahlrup and Lilita Freidenwald look at gender ethnicity and political inclusion, and they compare Macedonia and Sweden. And finally, there's an epilogue by Mara Maxfury. So we can go to the next slide. What I will present to you today draws mostly on the quite lengthy introduction and on the chapter I authored on the affinities and frontiers between the post-socialist and post-colonial. And already now we have almost 20 minutes. So I am glad that I have actually short the text. Otherwise, I would have taken an hour, which I will not. So I hope you will be not discontent with my presentation because I really have cut a lot. So as much I have been inspired by the flourishing post-colonial and decolonial scholarship and the global transnational perspective in this texts which are included in the book, I have also drawn on a further strand of scholarly debate, which can be called a meta-perspective on knowledge production and feminist theorizing. A kind of retrospective contemplation of the formation and impact of academic feminism. Exemplary for this kind of work is Sabine Haag, whom you probably will know, and in the Anglo-Saxon world, Claire Hemmings. There's also a growing body of work which employs such a meta-perspective on the field formation of feminist studies. Such a task entails an examination of the European East-West divide from a global and transnational perspective. For not only was the second word largely absent from the horizon of transnational feminist theory, but the connection between the second and the third worlds also became a peculiar political and historical void after the fall of the wall. The oblivion was mutual, as scholars state. Power works through oblivion. And even where we never can tell the true story, as Claire Hemmings states, the reconstruction of the forgotten and excluded can prove an important modus operandi for feminist theorizing to ensure its critical edge. I advocate a reorientation of analytical vision towards a horizon that explores the interrelations as well as the localization of non-Western Europe in a global and historical perspective, and the post-colonial interdependence. I call it a post-three world epistemic cartography. There will be two major parts in my presentation. One will be on this, what I call retrospective rephrasing of academic and transnational feminist genealogies. And the second about the affinities or frontiers between the post-socialist and the post-colonial. Probably the first one will be longer than the second one. We can move to the next slide, I think. A critical retrospection of the field transformation from a geopolitical perspective, as well as an ongoing transnationalization of gender history, profoundly challenge founding narratives such as the two waves of mobilization, the activist origin of feminist academia, and the hegemonic construct of transnational feminism according to the binary of Western and Third World feminism. This critical reclaiming work not only reveals that Western trajectories as the universal model underlie today's stories, which are at the same time overdetermined by US historical models, but also that the perspective of the winners as a progress narrative erases the conditions of its own emergence. The retrospective rephrasing, a term I borrow from Stuart Hall, of academic and transnational feminism, feminist genealogies, and aims to provincialize the story of Western academic feminism. The retrospective rephrasing of feminist genealogies helped me not only to understand the asymmetrical relation of the East-West divide in European women's and gender studies, but how much the hegemonic storylines and their linear temporality rest, as I already mentioned, on erasure and oblivion. The important insight have been for me the role of the process of decolonization for the emergence of the so-called second wave of Western feminism, as well as the second and third world connections and the importance at the UN level in shaping what has been termed women's rights as human rights agenda already way before 1989. The dissolution of the bipolar world order not only gave rise to a multipolar geopolitical figuration, but also shifted the guiding axis from the Eastern and Western blocs to that of the global North and global South. The Second World, as it was called before, exchanged its status as a political economic entity for that of a culturally and ethnically demarcated space as Eastern Europe and the Balkans, whose positionality is difficult to conceive and tends to be carved out of a cartography of absences. From the global perspective, the territory is added to the global North, tacked on to the West and the rest. Some have even called it the former socialist West. Ironically, along the new local global axis, the specificity of the East European position and the post-socialist condition tended to disappear. At the fourth UN World Conference on Women in Beijing, the famous one, this experience was the topic of the so-called statement from a non-region, which is debated in the text of Grabowska in Science already some years ago. Scholars writing about the conceptual and institutional foundations of the field of women's and gender studies, applying a meta perspective, usually refer to the Butler moment, the time around 1989, as a crucial turning point in the transition to cultural or linguistic modes of analysis, as well as the diversification of the fundamental category, which no longer are women but differences. By contrast, the end of state socialism is almost never mentioned in these works. The fundamental transformation of the field of possibilities of articulation of the theory in the context of a new world order seems to have not been reflected upon. In a handbook, Oxford Handbook of Feminist Theory, which has been published 2016, edited by Mary Hawkesworth and now I don't recall the first name, Dish. None of this chapter, none of the 50 chapters has keywords about post-socialism or authors present from Eastern Europe, socialist space, post-socialist space. I was shocked when I saw it. Let me now turn to this women's rights as human rights during the Cold War. During the Cold War, as you know, the normal story is that this frame, human rights as women's rights, has been framed precisely after the fall of the wall, and the Beijing conference is usually lifted at the most important event. During the Cold War, the antagonism of the systems constituted a rivalry in which each side functioned for the other as a negative image, but also as an incentive. One important arena of the mirroring of the systems was that of women politics at that time. On the stage of official international politics in the United Nations, questions of gender equality were a central focus of struggle. among the competing conceptions of human rights norms between the anti-imperial and the colonialist bloc in the 60s and 70s. For instance, the inclusion of the non-discrimination clauses in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was in large part due to the lobbying of the communist states, as was, in coalition with the non-aligned countries, the 1967 passage of the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. In the common Western narrative, for instance, in the work of Ali Tripp, the Commission was dominated by members from Western countries, she said. Tripp fails to cite the conflicts over competing right norms, as well as the controversies surrounding the UN Decade for Women. Only as of 1985, she suggests Deep the South began to challenge the ideological dominance of the North. While the UN conference in Mexico from 1975 was characterized by Western dominance, she claims. The progress narrative is here employed, whose happy end is then the 1990s concept of women's rights as human rights. This storyline creates a Western interpretative authority that did not exist at the time. In addition, the move toward hegemony of a Western and principally US understanding of human rights as an ethical regime remains unproblematized, which actually happens after '89. What is also an important part in the 70s is that, so to speak, the declaration of the Mexico conference explicitly refers to emancipation from oppression of women caused by colonialism, neocolonialism, Zionism, racial discrimination, and apartheid. So this is not something which appears then after '89. It has been at the agenda, at the international agenda, in the 70s and already earlier. During the Cold War, there was close cooperation between the second and third worlds on the international level and in the decolonization process. The process of decolonization enabled new ways of imagining political practice and social change. Actually, the term women's liberation drew on the language of decolonial struggles and national liberation movements. Socialist Yugoslavia, which remained outside the Soviet bloc and co-founded the non-aligned movement, was a central site for the exchange of ideas on the axis stretching from Havana to Paris, from Belgrade, Berlin, and Prague. The solidarity with Vietnam opened spaces for mobilization and provided language for criticism of both US and Soviet imperialism. The critical genealogy highlights that the currently prevalent story of international women's mobilization and supranational encounters as a shift from global sisterhood to transnational feminism is a Western one. A homogenizing understanding of women's issues and rights was geopolitically contested from the outset. In sum, it could be said that the origins of intersectionality are to be found not in the American feminist academia, but in international encounters and transnational organizations. Something similar can be said with regard to the women's rights as human rights agenda. As early as 1974, Yugoslav Representative Vida Tomšić demanded Planned Parenthood should be promoted as a human right. Whereas Tomšić is essentially unknown in the Western canon, Indian scholar and founding mother of the Development Alternatives with Women's Network, Devakian, places Tomšić in what she calls her pantheon of goddess in the context of the UN Decade for women. This alternative genealogy may also contribute to the nuancing of the prevailing perception of the late arrival of voices from the Second World to the international women's activism. Could we, I'm not sure, yeah. The stories about the oblivion of academic feminism. Whereas academic feminism has been usually narrated as a heroic interloper emerging from grassroots activism, some critical publications tell another story. We can say that the institutionalization of women gender studies in Western countries was indeed the result of political and academic struggles facilitated by transformation that had been taking place in higher education since the 60s. In the United States, women's studies were embedded in the Cold War apparatus of what has been called ideological warfare with the Soviet Union, which, as the American scholar Krugin-Gehr posits, profoundly influenced scholarly practices. Krugin-Gehr's study of the feminist journal par excellence, you all know the journal, Science, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, reveals that Science was, from the time of its inception in 1975, linked to both the US State Department and the US Agency for International Development. It was also founded by corporate philanthropy. The funding regime made the project of development and the study of third world women who at the time were leaning to its socialist frameworks, a central issue. This correlated with the warning of other perspectives, such as Black American feminism. I don't know whether you know this, that Mohanty's text, Under Western Eyes, was rejected by Science. This was one of the reasons, she was so critical about this homogenizing, patronizing approaching of the so-called third world women. Her text then was traveling through Europe and translation back to the US. The breakdown of state socialism reorganized the metrics of happiness, to use Sarah Ahmed's term, in profound ways. In a certain sense, a restoration of the civilization map of the 19th century and the Orientalist imaginary was taking place. This was made particularly explicit with the use of the term Europeanization to describe the process of the so-called Eastern enlargement of the European Union. In the field of women's gender studies, too, the constellation was marked by contradictory orientations. Several entwined developments coincided: the end of state socialism, a strengthening of the process of professionalization and transnationalization of academic feminism, which was supported by the European Union, and epistemological shifts that occurred in tandem with this geopolitical positioning. In 1991, the European Feminist Research Conference in Aalborg, Denmark, under the auspices of the European Council, was the first conference of its kind, forming the so-called Europeanization of gender studies. In the memories of Yugoslav scholars, it was not the gathering in Aalborg that provided the funding moment of pan-European academic feminism and the birthplace of Athena. You might know the project, but the conferences in Dubrovnik in the 80s, in which also Rosi Braidotti took part, actually. Europeanization made it possible for Western feminist theorizing and activism to position itself as more advanced and progressive. In this sense, epistemic authority and the growth of institutional power in the context of the new funding regimes co-produced one another. One could even argue that Western feminist scholarship only appeared with the fall of the Eastern Bloc. Until then, the preferential vocabulary consisted of political epithets such as radical, socialist, liberal, black, Chicana, lesbian. Western stands rather for an epistemic and cultural place. It is a deep historical irony that a progress narrative, though the formation of the field of feminism itself came into being just as feminist theorizing purged itself from master categories of progress. The failure of socialism, and as Robin Wiegmann puts it, the category of failure of women, is the founding paradigm of feminist knowledge production, reconfigured feminist scholarship in profound ways. The perspective moved from one of systems to one of subjectivity and the search for difference proper. The periodization storyline inherent in the progress narrative, from simple theoretization, essentialized theoretization, to difference, post-structuralism, constructionism, had a considerable impact on the East-West encounters after '89, contributing as it did to the late arrival status of the scholars of Eastern Europe. The perception of late arrival and lagging behind as a kind of wound is still today the most common description that scholars from non-Western Europe offer of their own positionality. So now I will turn to the last part, the affinities between the post-decolonial, which I wish could be longer and more elaborate, but you see, I've already talked 36 minutes. So few would dispute today that feminist theorizing has moved beyond the cultural turn. The taxonomies are being reworked anew with the new societal configurations and power relations, which themselves are characterized by highly contradictory constellations of increased fluidity, neoliberalism, and neocolonialism, as well as new liberties and exclusion based on the recognition of differences, but also on the culturalization of stratification and commodification of bodies. Feminist theorizing and the post-decolonial framework share, in my view, two dimensions: an analytical perspective from which to explore the world critically, and simultaneously the critical questioning of its own analytical concepts. Both are fields that have been in a mode of perpetual autocritique, as has been stated. In a sophisticated essay, Stuart Hall located the post-colonial field in the midst of a shift of power knowledges, regimes, a still emergent new episteme information. He argued, on the next page, next slide, please. No, it's here. It's here. Sorry, it was there. I included this quote so you can read it. He argued against the careless homogenizing of the concept for an attentive assessment of different global dominations, as different social formations are certainly not post-colonial in the same way, but this does not mean that they are not post-colonial in any way. So the post-colonial, decolonial theoretical frameworks are primarily oriented towards the West and the West, whereby Europe is equated to the West. They have inspired scholars in gender studies and in other disciplines to consider the entanglements and hierarchization within Europe in new ways. One of the pitfalls of the debates about the posts has been thinking in analogies between the post-colonial and the post-socialist, which also was present in the early feminist debates in the 90s. Another one is the highly polemical demarcation of the decolonial against the post-colonial, which I will not go here into much detail because I am running out of time, but we can take it up in the debate, which tends to flatten the complexity of a broad corpus of relevant scholarship and the different threats depending on the discipline and geopolitical positioning. Postcolonial studies today by no means remain limited to the usual empires such as Great Britain and France, but are sprawling across a wide spectrum of imperial powers, including Russia, the Soviet Union, and include not only the Nordic countries, but also Switzerland, studying the complicity with colonial projects since 1600. The fact that the language of postcolonial paradigms has detached itself from the world of academia and is today applied in political struggles, like in Poland, for instance, can be seen critically. To me, it seems to be the evidence that the imaginary of the post-colonial resonates with crucial questions of our time. Since the early 2000, growing interest has arisen in scholarly perspective on post-socialist studies beyond the transition frame. One might interpret it as a part of a broader reorienting of the scale and lens of critical thinking that reached into many disciplines and research after '89. Discussions on what qualifies as colonialism concern research beyond the post-state socialist and Eastern European space, in which especially the classification of the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union poses a significant and controversial question. Particularly strong debate it is whether the conquering of neighboring areas that marked the continental European empire should be seen as colonial. Historians underscore the disorienting ambiguity of the colonial phenomena. This in turn is entangled with the question of the extent to which cultural foreignness and otherness are valid as defining criteria in the colonial sense. Martina Flostanova emphasizes, for example, that the liberation of the white Catholic Poles from the Russian Soviet yoke is not the same as the decolonization in Africa, where the people were coded as absolutely different. She perceives the parallel between what is called the Homo post-Sovieticus and the racialized other of Western modernity and incongruous and inappropriate distortion. Flostanova's criticism is directed at the tendency to analogize, which has shaped a number of scholarly debates that conceive post-colonialism and post-communism as quasi one of the same. Today, it can be noted that the post-colonial, decolonial perspective in research on non-Western Europe is not a project of singularity or sameness and represents in no way a direct transfer of theoretical toolkits, but is a translation and bastardization. It is not restricted to the state socialist period and its legacies. Rather, the horizon has broadened enormously with respect to both time and space. The rewriting of Europe's spatio-temporal geography is embedded within the colonial and imperial designs that shaped the emergence of the modern world system, hence also situated within the global coloniality, enable important insights for the historical hierarchization and the ongoing rebordering within Europe. What I will try to shorten, otherwise I could talk more. I thought I was shortening already. Okay, what we can see from this really vast literature which is existing already is that a kind of field of comparative post-colonial studies in Europe emerged and shows, so to speak, how different this post and decolonial perspective and incorporated in various national contexts. For instance, in Poland, it is is a kind of political battlefield where the it's rather about the Polish-Russian confrontation than about, so to speak, the world-scale dependencies in which Poland is included. What is compared to classical post-colonial perspective is this kind of in-betweenness, which is observed, so to speak, being west of Russia and east of West. Okay, this positionality of in-betweenness is something that is debated in different ways. Another issue which is also debated extensively is whether race and racialization is relevant or is it not. Maybe we can return to it in the discussion, otherwise I will, so to speak, take too much time here. In the book, there are texts which deal with this kind of liminal Europeanness and this process of racialization within Europe, and these differences between Eastern and other concepts of racialization, process of racializations. Let me go to the final paragraphs. A new geography of power is currently emerging. The post-colonial framework offers a meeting ground for a way of thinking that is pertinent to the current condition. At the boundaries of an epochal transformations and re-articulations of the undigested past, as it could be called. I argue that the post-colonial framework is indeed timely, that it enables a theoretization that can narrow the gap which has been so pertinent since '89 between cultural analysis and social theory in feminist theorizing, and grasp the ongoing simultaneity of culturalization and stratifications. Let me stop here.